Hello and welcome to Roll the Tutor. My name is Benny and today I want to present to you a deck tech on Shalai and Hallar. Before we get into why you might be interested in this deck, I want to talk to you about why I picked up this particular commander pairing. Before picking up Shalai and Hallar, I played Selesnya for about a year. I started on Selvala, then moved to Sayona and ended up trying Sithis for a bit. The most success I had with any of those decks and the most enjoyment / the closest match to my personal preferred playstyle ended up being Sayona. That is in part due to the fact that I had a very particular shell and playstyle, a very particular direction for each of the decks in mind. But the strongest selling point for Sayona is that it's a one-card win con in the command zone, and it's able to run every bit of artifact hate that there is in the game. So you get to run Null Rod, you get to run Collector Oof, and you get to run a couple of slightly less effective pieces, and they're all asymmetrical within the shell of Sayona. Because, well, we don't have access to Dockside, and we're not running any artifacts outside of Stacks pieces, not even Soul Ring. We're not on any Rule of Laws. We'll get into that a bit later. Now, the limitations with Sayona are plentiful. Some of the drawbacks attached to Sayona is you need a lot of setup. Your win attempt is going to be pretty telegraphed. There is a certain amount of inevitability, but that comes mostly through setting up through resolved stacks pieces. I did get kind of a respectable win rate out of this particular deck. You know, there's some merits are just from the way it's set up as a parasitic deck. A lot of decks are not going to respect you at the table with the commander that reads like Sayona does. There's only really one card in the deck that acts as a one-card win con, and it's a non-creature spell. So let's just briefly talk about the combo. The combo is Sayona plus Shielded by Faith. Shielded by Faith is an enchantment that when it targets Sayona, Sayona triggers, making a 1/1. Then Shielded by Faith triggers, attaching itself to the 1/1. Again, Sayona triggers, making another 1/1, and you have an infinite loop to make infinite summoning sick 1/1s. So you need another turn rotation, and the combo is the primary reason why we can't run Rule of Law effects in this deck. I'm personally not a fan of Rule of Law in general, and also I think it's a really bad time in the meta to be playing Rule of Law effects outside of commanders that really have a lot of card advantage out of the command zone. But anyway, the way the combo works, you need to resolve your commander, and then you need to resolve the Shielded by Faith. Once you cast your commander, everyone is going to be on high alert, because why would you cast a commander that does essentially nothing and doesn't even have a respectable body unless you are trying to resolve the combo? So in order to have any sort of inevitability and to have a little bit less of a telegraph play, you need to do it in one turn and not across multiples. So you cast your commander, you cast a Shielded by Faith, then you have infinite 1/1s, and then you still need to wait for another turn's rotation until you can attack with those 1/1s. In other words, your opponents need to be somewhat locked out. So there needs to be at least a soft lock where someone's not going to just combo over what you're doing, or combo in between you resolving combo and going for the win on the following turn. Let's talk about Shalai and Hallar. So Shalai and Hallar is similar to Sayona in the fact that it's a one-card win con out of the command zone, but it has myriad upsides. So let's talk about some of those. Number one, we have red. So what does red offer us here? So in this specific deck list, obviously Dockside, then Imperial Recruiter for cards like Dockside, and the Red Terror. We'll talk about that in a second. We get access to Deflecting SWAT, which is particularly useful in a deck that relies on its commander to win the game a lot through an A+B type combo. And that is it, right? So those are our 4 red spells outside of the commander. Now let's talk win cons. So again, it's an A+B combo out of the command zone. Red Terror is one of the cards that goes infinite with our commander. How does this work? So Shalai and Hallar pings an opponent of your choice when one or more counters are put on a creature you control. Red Terror says whenever Red Source deals damage to one or more permanents and or players, put a 1/1 counter on the Red Terror. So what you do is you resolve your commander, you wait a turn rotation, you resolve the red terror, then you move to attack with your commander deals combat damage, red terror triggers, putting a 1/1 on your commander shoots for a damage, it's a red source, it'll trigger itself, and then you ping infinite damage and win the game. Upside here is that we get to tutor for the red terror as it's a creature, and green is particularly good at tutoring for creatures. The red terror, being a creature, is a lot better at fighting counterspells or getting around counterspells more specifically. And we're not just relying on a single copy of a card for an A+B type combo. We also have Heliod. Heliod, similarly, when you give a creature lifelink, it'll trigger when you cause damage, putting a 1/1 counter on the creature, which will trigger our commander, Shalai and Hallar, which will start pinging. And if Shalai and Hallar is the creature that has lifelink, then it'll keep doing it and you get infinite damage. There's a notable interaction I want to point out here. This is a combo that works even when Shalai and Hallar is summoning sick. You just need enough mana. So you need to resolve Heliod and Shalai and Hallar on the same turn. And you need to have some sort of attacker that can't be blocked. So let's say you have a Dirk flying around that you didn't use to cast your commander. You move to attack. You give the creature lifelink using Heliod's ability, and then when it's unblocked, it'll trigger Heliod after you gain life, putting a 1/1 on your commander. Now at that point you hold priority and you pay another 2 mana through Heliod's ability, giving Shalai and Hallar lifelink, which will mean that the damage that it pings after you pass priority on its trigger will have lifelink, and that again will trigger Heliod, putting a counter on your commander, and so it'll ping again for infinite damage. Combo number 3 is Dockside Emil. It's also the most, I would say, the main combo, the combo that we go for the most, because it is the most inevitable, it requires the least amount of mana, and it doesn't need any setup whatsoever, so you don't need to resolve your commander prior. What you do is obvious to everyone who's ever played Kenrith, so Dockside and Emil. You activate Emil's first ability, flicker Dockside if your opponents have 4 or more artifacts/enchantments, then Dockside and Emil will go infinite through a repeated flickering. Now, what most people don't get is that at this point you've already won the game because your outlet is your commander. Note Emil's second ability, which is always forgotten. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay a green or a white if you do put a 1/1 counter on it, etc., etc. So what happens is you make infinite mana using Dockside Emil, then you cast your commander with infinite mana, and then you start flickering Dockside again. Now, whenever Dockside enters the battlefield, using Emil's triggered ability, you pay a green or a white and put a 1/1 counter on Dockside, which will trigger your commanders. And Shalai and Hallar will ping an opponent, well, all of your opponents to death through infinite damage. So now let's talk about the direction I took the deck into, because it is somewhat different compared with Siona. The main difference is that we can't run Artifact Hate because it's symmetrical. And symmetrical stacks pieces are just not in a great place in cEDH right now, so we can't play Artifact Hate, and we shouldn't play Rule of Law because, again, our commander is one that encourages 1-card win conditions, pseudo 1-card win conditions, because we still need to resolve our commander. So Dockside Emil doesn't really work in a post-Rule of Law world. Similarly, if we're going to go for, say, Shalai and Hallar plus the Red Terror, you lose so much inevitability if you have to do it across multiple turns, and people are almost sure to have interaction if they can set up for it. And we are leaning a lot further into the parasitic nature. So what I mean by that is we are proactive, but we don't show it until we win the game. So what we do is hang by the sidelines, wait a bit, set up, wait for someone else's win attempt to be countered by one of the blue players at the table, and or bide our time with stacks pieces which we know aren't going to hard lock our opponents at any point. We're not ever opting for that. It's only an attempt at slowing down the game enough for us to resolve our win con. Notably, we're only really running 4 stacks effects, but those are all asymmetrical. So number 1, Drannith Magistrate, number 2, Aven Mind Sensor, Number 3, Chalice of the Void, which is almost always going to be cast on 0. And number 4, Deafening Silence. One of the things I did is, instead of doubling down on more and more similar but slightly less effective stacks effects, is running ways to protect our stacks pieces. So again, here we have Ephemerate. In the main deck we have Deflecting Swat, which we already talked about, Veil of Summer, Noxus Revival. And in the same vein, I want to point towards Emil, which doesn't just combo, but can also protect stacks pieces by flickering them out of play when removal is aimed at them, as well as Ashaya, which can invalidate all of the blue bounce instants, such as Chain of Vapor, etc., by turning our creatures into lands. This also has to be the best deck for Plaza of Heroes that I've ever seen. We are running a non-negligible amount of legendary creatures. Our Commandal is vital to us, and paying 3 and sacking a land is absolutely worth it when we're on our combo turn. Now, you might have noticed already that there's a secondary win con that doesn't rely on our commander. So of course, Emil and Dockside can also combo with Walking Ballista and or Finale of Devastation, and since we're running Heliod, we're also on Walking Ballista, but I'm referring to Ashaya plus Mana Dorks plus Quirion Ranger / Scrib Ranger. How does that work? So what you need is a Mana Dork that taps for more than 1 green. You need to resolve the Ashaya, turning the, let's say, Bloom Tender into a forest. Tap the non-summoning sick Bloom Tender for 2 mana, let's say a green and a white. Cast Quirion Ranger, also a land. Activate Quirion Ranger, bouncing Quirion Ranger to your hand since it can target itself, being a land. Untap Bloom Tender, tap Bloom Tender, float green, white, etc., and then you end up with infinite mana. And yeah, assuming Bloom Tender can tap for 3, you also have red and green. Another outlet at this point would be Duskwatch Recruiter, which we didn't talk about. There are a couple of aspects about this deck which I would put in the negotiable category, because I'm not 100% if they're going to remain in the deck long term. But since every deck list really is dynamic with the ebb and flow of sets, rotations, etc., no deck list is really ever completely finished. So all right, last thing I want to talk about is a small counters sub-theme, which is something that I was pointed to by a member of the community who also experimented with this deck a little bit, and suggested that if you wanted to run Rule of Law effects, you could take the deck into an extreme value-oriented build, which would rely on counters and certain cards that profit asymmetrically from those effects. So of note, there's 2 cards that I am running here. It's a sub-theme, so this is not something that we're going to be relying on. Most of the time we're tutoring for our combo, resolving it, trying to win the game. But if we are in a very slow pod where we need to grind value, we can off of 2 cards, which are Keen Sense and, not combos, Keen Sense and Snake Umbra, which both have the same text, which is whenever enchanted creature deals damage to an opponent, you may draw a card. So our commander does ping for a damage when we put a counter on things, and there are cards such as Defiler of Vigor being the most notable include here. Makes our green spells 1 green pip cheaper, and whenever we do cast a green permanent spell, we get to put a 1/1 counter on all of our creatures. Now note the wording of Shalai and Hallar, which says whenever 1 or more 1/1 counters are put on a creature you control, it deals that much damage to target opponent, which means that every 1/1 counter that's put on an individual creature will trigger Shalai and Hallar individually. So if we have a Keen Sense attached to our commander while Defiler triggers, then we will be drawing that many cards. Let's say we have 6 creatures in play, we resolve a Utopia Sprawl, then Keen Sense through our commander will draw 6 cards. Lion Sash is kind of a inconspicuous pseudo stacks piece that can tax our opponent's graveyards, and whenever we do remove a permanent this way, we will be triggering our commander, and again, if there's a Keen Sense attached to it, we draw a card. Heliod has a similar effect, which we talked about earlier when referencing the combo. Catilda, while turning a lot of creatures that would otherwise not be able to produce mana into Mana Dorks, also has a secondary ability that can put counters on each creature we control, which is a big upside in a deck like this. We've referenced Emil previously. Again, we're talking about adding counters to permanents here. The final card I want to talk about, thing is, if we have our commander resolved, this is a great way of protecting it through giving it ward. The cool thing also about ward is once you pass priority on the trigger, the spell that you cast will fizzle. Okay, but notably Leyline Immersion goes mana positive, which is nice. In a world where it doesn't get countered, you have now, let's say, your commander with ward that'll tap for 5 mana in any combination of colors. And of course, we're running it for a particular reason, which is that it can turn our commander, say, into a mana dork that'll make infinite mana with Ashaya, right? Ashaya plus Ranger, Quirion Ranger, like we talked about earlier. Yeah, and of course, I mean, I'll just briefly talk about the tutor package. We are running most of the tutors that you would expect. Invasion of Ikoria is notably a newer one. Recruiter of the Guard and Imperial Recruiter. Those are both primarily just redundant ways of finding Dockside to combo. Then there are spells that we would expect to see in decks like this. Green Sun Zenith, not in every list anymore, but Finale and Eldritch Evolution, absolutely standard. Chord of Calling, Eladamri's Call, Worldly Tutor, Enlightened Tutor, Survival of the Fittest, and Sterling Grove. Sterling Grove, not talked about previously, and just adding like a protective layer on top before we want to, say, fetch for a Heliod to end the game. And I think I'll leave it at that. Overall, I'm very happy with how the deck feels at this point. I went through a couple of iterations, one of them trying out a Rule of Law package that really didn't end up working out too well. Is this deck better than Rocco, which is the obvious comparison? Probably not. Rocco is a little more proactive. It's also a parasitic deck. It's, I would say, a little more inevitable. The big upside over Rocco is that in a world where Drannith Magistrate has resolved, you are not completely out of the game. So we do play into and around stacks pieces on opposing battlefields, such as even Rule of Laws, a lot better than a deck like Rocco would that just gets shut off by those. And yeah, with that, I'll leave you guys. Any questions, comments, I would appreciate about this deck. Any inputs or suggestions, I would also be happy about. This is still a brew sort of in the earlier stages. This is the first thing that I'm happy to post and share. But there are certain aspects of the deck that still feel a bit unfinished. Like I said, the Ashaya package, I'm not 100% on whether or not that will remain in the deck indefinitely, or we'll switch it around and or out at some point. The counters package feels good at this point. Again, that can be subject to change. You know the deal. Let me know how you feel. Oh, actually, that's stolen. See you later.